This is Rise of Civilization, Who Owns the Past? And with this, we're going to discuss cultural resource management. If you ever want to go into archaeology, you need to know that a majority of the jobs are in cultural resource management. And what started cultural resource management and the whole environmental movement was the book Silent Spring in the 1960s by Rachel Carson. You might not know the book, but if you know the Joni Mitchell song, A Paved Paradise Put Up a Parking Lot, which was also redone by Counting Crows, basically up until the 1960s and 1970s, there were no environmental protections in place. And her premise was that if they kept spraying the fruit with insecticides, it would kill the birds and there would be no spring. And basically, during that time, no one was protecting environmental resources. And whether you realize it or not, it wasn't until the 1970s that the Environmental Protection Act was finally established. I can tell you from firsthand experience, most of you have grown up with biohazard boxes and rubber gloves and coated candy that's wrapped. Well, when I was growing up, I'm from New Jersey, and as a teenager, we would go down the Jersey Shore. But when we did, a lot of times you'd be swimming in the ocean and hypodermic needles would come floating by, glass vials, turds, all kinds of stuff, because guess what? All the New York hospitals were dumping their medical waste into the Hudson River, which was going out into the Atlantic Ocean. And this was also occurring with factories. No one was looking out for the environment. So with the Environmental Protection Act, everyone said, okay, we're going to protect the environment for future generations. Yay! But then people started wondering, shouldn't we save our archaeological resources as well? Again, after World War II is the time, and up through the 1970s and even the 1980s, you had all the housing developments being built, you had the interstates being constructed, you had shopping malls. Before that, there were none of those things. And whenever they were bulldozing the ground, if they came across archaeological sites, they basically just destroyed them. So pieces of legislation after the 1970s were passed saying that anytime a public project was to be constructed on state, federal, municipal land, archaeologists needed to make sure no site was being destroyed. Yay, right? And so that's where cultural resource management started. That means that anytime anything is built, archaeologists go through, except public land, or excuse me, private land, the archaeologists will go through and walk the proposed site. They did it with the pipeline, they do it with roads, they do it with all kinds of stuff to make sure no archaeological sites are destroyed. But that's not the end of the story. What you need to know is that archaeologists have a very long history of excavating Native American graves, and it wasn't pretty. Basically, because they were trying to figure out how North and South America were populated, they felt the key was by studying Native American skeletal remains. And so what they would do is they would go from all the big schools, Harvard, Yale, you name it, go to the Southwest, in particular, go to Indian graveyards, and without asking anyone's permission, just start digging up people's relatives. And what they would do is they would take them back to their respective schools under the guise of science, but in most cases, they never did anything with the skeletal remains. Legislation was passed. Guess what? In the federal legislation around this time period, 1970s, um, what it said was an Indian skeleton after 30 years was considered an artifact. Go figure. So, come the 1960s, and you had all the radical groups being formed. You had the Black Panthers, you had the SDS, which was the Radical Student Movement. And so the Radical Indian Movement was called AIM, the American Indian Movement. If anybody's heard of Leonard Peltier, he is someone that was jailed during this time. And even though he's pretty much been proven innocent, he's still in jail. He's an old man now, and he's considered a political prisoner by most Native Americans. So the question came up then, who owns America's past? Here's a quote from the Times. If you desecrate a white grave, you wind up sitting in prison, but desecrate an Indian grave and you get a PhD. The time has come for people to decide, are we Indians part of the country's living culture, or are we just here to supply museums with dead bodies? So, after the 1960s and onwards, the Native Americans really started exercising their political clout. It took until 1988, but at that time, a federal committee on Indian affairs was formed in the legislature, and guess what they found? They found that 43,306 individual Native Americans were held in 163 United States museums. Now, what they mean by that is dead bodies. And although Native Americans represented 1% of the United States population, their bones comprised more than 54% of the skeletal collection in the Smithsonian Institution. And again, I can't stress enough, I've been there for my dissertation. Many of these skeletons have never been looked at. They're all in file cabinets, but file cabinets that are much more horizontal and only about a foot high vertically. So this is what you really, really need to know. In 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This is a very complicated act. I'm giving you an oversimplification of it, but basically, four main parts of it were: 1. Protected Indian graves on federal and tribal lands. What did this mean? This meant that they could not go into Indian graveyards and dig up dead bodies. It recognized tribal authority over unmarked graves. This meant that if you were on tribal land and you found a skull, you couldn't just pick it up, put it on your mantelpiece, and put a ball cap on it. It was against the law. This one really is interesting. It prohibited, the commercial selling of Native American dead bodies because there was a market for human bodies. There still is. Any school supply catalog, medical supply, they sell bodies for scientific purposes, educational purposes. Okay. But a lot of collectors had this thing for Native American skulls and bodies, so it's against the law. Finally, it required the inventory and repatriation of human remains held by the government and institutions receiving federal money. Almost every university and every museum receives federal money. So, what that meant is repatriation you hear a lot about in Alaska. What that means is they have to return the remains. And everyone knew exactly where the stuff came from. So, it wasn't a problem. They had to inventory it and they had to repatriate or return all the human remains that they had. This was a really, really, really big deal. And we'll continue this in part 2.